welcome to this session of Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church. I'm Peter Pettit, the teaching pastor at St. Paul, and as we enter upon our study of the Bible's big stories, we start today with the first of those big stories, the story of creation. I encourage you, before you view this video, to read that story in the beginning of the book of Genesis, chapters 1 and 2. One could ask the question, why does the Bible begin with creation at all? Why would it have to begin with that? That's actually a question that was asked in antiquity by an individual named Rabbi Isaac, and then it was made famous by a 11th century rabbi, commentator on the Bible, whose nickname was Rashi, and Rashi is widely known throughout the Jewish world as the most authoritative and most widely read commentator on the Bible and also the Talmud. And the question that Isaac asked, which Rashi popularized, is why does the Bible have to begin with creation? And we might think, if after all the Bible, the Jewish Bible, which Genesis opens up, is the national story of the Jewish people, why doesn't it begin with Abraham and Sarah, the great ancestors of the Jewish people? And if the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, which Genesis opens up, is a kind of description of the lifestyle that God gave to the people of Israel in order to live as God's people, to be God's people in the world, then it might actually have started with Exodus 12:2. Where God says, this month is to be for you the first of the months. Isaac says this is really the first commandment that's given to Israel, telling them to create a calendar with this month, the month of Nisan, as the first of the months. And that's the beginning of the story of Exodus, which of course is also a very central, significant story in the creation of the people Israel. So, why does the Bible start with creation? I would suggest that we might do well to look at the story of creation to try to find out what we might think about that question. And as you've read Genesis 1 and 2, perhaps you've noticed, perhaps you've known for some time, that scholars tend to see in this two stories. The story of creation begins at Genesis 1:1, when God began to create, or in the beginning God created. But then when we get to Genesis 2:4, there seems to be another start. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Or maybe that's a summary of what we've seen already, and then it's the next line that actually starts the second story, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Well, however we might want to divide that, what's worth noticing is that we have already two stories that depict the earth creation coming into being. And let's look at each of those. In Genesis 1, we have what has been described as a hymn, perhaps a poem. It is very clearly ordered, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. It is rhythmic in its language. We see these repeated formulas of, and God said, let there be, and it was so. And God saw, and it was good. And God made, and it came into being. There's a formality about this in many ways that speaks of a desire to structure things, to show how everything's in relationship to everything else. In fact, one of the patterns that we can see here is a structuring of these 7 days into 3 and 3 and 1. So in verses 3 through 5 of Genesis 1, God creates light, the realm of light. And then in the verses, that's day 1. And then in verses 6 through 8, it's day 2, and God separates the waters from the heavens. The waters and the heavens are created. And then on day 3, verses 9 through 13, God makes the dry land appear. So we have light, we have waters and heavens, and then we have dry land, days 1, 2, and 3. Then on days 4, 5, and 6, paralleling those, we've got the architecture of the created order. Now we populate it. So on day 4, God creates the lights, the sun, the moon. God creates the stars in the sky. All the lights that populate the realm of light. Day and night are what they're named in day 1, but all the specific lights of the sun and the moon and the stars are named in day 4. And then the heavens and the seas of day 2 are populated on day 5 with birds and fishes. And finally, on day 6, the dry land, earth that has appeared and been created on day 3, is populated with all of the animal life, everything that creeps on the earth and that walks on the earth and that consumes the plants of the earth, all created on day 6, culminating in the creation of the humans. Or I should say the human, because it really is portrayed in this story. God says, let us make humanity in our image. A single thing, a collective, distinguished as male and female, but collectively in the image of God. And these humans, the last thing that are made at the evening of day 6, are given dominion over everything that has been created in the heavens and the seas and on the earth. Every good plant for food is given to them. It's an open range for them. They're given dominion. They're given what they need to thrive. And God looked at everything God had made and said, it was very good. 3 days for the architecture, 3 days to populate it, and beginning in chapter 2, on the 7th day, God created rest. That's the first story. So what? What does it mean? What's the takeaway from all this? How does it impact you to hear that creation is done according to this story, according to our Bible? It's done with such a majestic, stately, ordered, thoughtful, organized, patterned, almost ritual kind of method. And that humanity is given dominion over all of it, with an open range in which to sustain itself and all of the creation. And that God rested and created rest on that 7th day. Think about that. Write down a few things that for you are takeaways from understanding creation this way. Why would the Bible open with this? And then let's turn to chapter 2. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly where it starts, beginning of verse 4, middle of verse 4. I don't think it begins just with verse 5. And there are good arguments for whether it starts at the beginning of 4, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, or whether that's the closing line of the previous story and then the new story opens up with on the day when God made the heavens and the earth. It doesn't really matter that we solve that problem. It's just to recognize that there's clearly a new beginning here. There's a new start to what turns out to be another story of creation. Now, I know there are those who've said that the first chapter is the kind of the big story of creation, and then the second chapter zooms in on the creation of the humans. And so it's a kind of expansion of day 6 from the first chapter. The only challenging point about that is that in the first chapter, God's already created all the animals on day 5 before humanity comes along. And here in chapter 2, it zooms in on the human, but then after creating the human, God creates all the animals. So we probably really do, for a variety of reasons that we don't have to detail, we probably really do have 2 different stories that have been combined here. And it'll be worth asking why they were combined, why somebody didn't just choose between them. But let's look at that second story for itself and ask the same kind of question. Why would someone start the Bible like this? What is its significance in saying, here's how the beginning came about? Well, it's not hard to recognize that chapter 2 is much more of a story, where chapter 1 was much more of a poem or a hymn. We don't have the repeated formulas here that we had in chapter 1. We don't have the formality. We don't really have the majesty of it. It's much more kind of homespun in a lot of ways. Not only that, but while chapter 1 was universal, it included day and night, the stars, the heavens, the waters above the heavens, the waters below the earth. This really focuses, it does zoom in on the earth. It starts out by saying, there were no bushes. There was nothing at all. It was kind of a wilderness wasteland, and a mist went up from the earth already there. The mist went up and watered all the earth. And what happens? God creates a human being. Interestingly, it's a singular human being, and the story will actually build off the fact of that human being solitary. Interestingly, too, we end the story with the creation of a second human being. So by the end of the story, we do in fact have humanity in its maleness and femaleness, but not created as a single humanity this time, rather kind of bracketing everything else that goes on in this story of creation. And what is it that goes on? Well, God really only creates a few things in this one. After the human is put there, God plants a garden and plants trees in the garden. And there's a certain tree in the center of the garden that actually God says, you need to not eat from that tree. So the open range that was there at the end of chapter 1, in this story, not so much. There's a restriction. There are trees, there are plants, there are bushes, there are shrubs, there's a garden. The human is put there to till it, to work it, In this case, not so much dominion as maybe servanthood. But there's a particular tree. Don't touch it. There's a restriction in the range here. God goes on because this human is alone, and God says that's not a good thing. And so then the animals all get created. And one by one, they get brought to the human being. And the human being names them all. Says, this is a cow, this is a dog, that's a bird, a robin, that's a starling, this is an anteater, that's an aardvark. They all get named. But not one of them is a fit companion for the human. And so as the story nears its end, God reaches into that human being, draws out something from his side, and fashions that into a counterpart, to which the human being responds, this at last is bone from my bone and flesh from my flesh. It's interesting that in the first story, it's God who speaks about the creation of the human. Let us make humankind in our image. In the image of God, let us make humankind. Male and female, let us make them. God exults over the creation of the human in chapter 1. God saw that it was very good. Here, it's the human exulting over the other human. This at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. The story is much more humanly oriented. And then suddenly it's over. Oh, but there's a therefore at the end of it, in this last verse or two. Because after the first human has rejoiced over a second, a fit companion, bone of bone, flesh of flesh, the storyteller adds, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother. Who are they for this guy? Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Is that the point of this whole second story, or is it just an implication from the way in which the second human was created? It's one of the questions we have to address. It's interesting that in this story, that in itself, the two shall be one flesh, is kind of a foreshadowing, an anticipation of the fact that in the next story, which we know as the serpent and the tree and the fruit and the sin, in that story, they're anything but one flesh. They end up pitted against each other as he blames her and she blames the serpent and such like. But there's another aspect of this story that leads us on into the next story, because the final line of chapter 2 says, and they were both naked, and they were not ashamed. There's a pun here with the first verse of chapter 3, because where it says they were both naked, that's arumim in Hebrew. And then when it says in chapter 3, verse 1, the serpent was the most crafty or sneaky of all the animals, that Hebrew word for the serpent's sneakiness is arum. They were arumim and not ashamed. The snake is arum and ends up bringing shame. So while chapter 1 ends with the seventh day, the capstone, we've had 3 and 3, now there's 1 with rest. It's been good, 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 and now it's very good, and God rested. Everything seems to come to a quiet pause. In chapter 2, the oneness that they are supposed to be and the unashamed nakedness that they're supposed to carry both point forward to the continuation of the story. So, what do we make of this one? I ask you again, what's your takeaway from this? It's homier, it's more narrowed in its focus. Humanity is not the capstone, but rather the bracketing. It's not humanity created together, but two separately who end up being brought together as one. It's not a story that's majestic and stately and carefully structured to land on a stable point, but it's a narrative that has in it the foreshadowings of more to come. What's your takeaway from a story like this with its themes and its images? Those are the things that we want to talk about as we look at this creation story in itself, not thinking yet about what other biblical writers have done with it or how this one might actually already incorporate maybe some earlier stories that were known to the biblical authors. Let's just start, as the Bible does, with this story in its two parts and think about what's here. What are we meant to have from this? That's a question for us to answer. Now, I look forward to our discussion of it. Oh, and by the way, when Rabbi Isaac asked his question, why does the Bible start with creation? His answer was, so that Israel and all the nations understand that Israel lives in relationship to a God who is the God not just of Israel, but of all things. Interesting takeaway. Is it one of yours? God bless.
Yeah.